They called him a monster. They called her worthless. So when the town forced them together, everyone waited for the disaster, and nobody prepared for what actually happened. A scarred mountain man who'd broken every bride sent to him. A heavy-set woman every man had rejected. One frozen ridge where survival meant trusting the person you had every reason to hate. This is not a love story about perfect people. This is the story of two outcasts who burned an entire conspiracy to the ground and built something fiercer from the ashes. Stay with me until the end. Drop a like and comment the city you're watching from. I want to see how far the story travels. Chapter 1. What the mountain kept the wind off Black Ridge. Didn't so much blow as hit. A flat, punishing wall of cold that smacked a person in the face like an open palm and kept pushing until their eyes watered and their thoughts scattered. Most people in the valley below had never gone past the tree line. Not because the trail was technically impossible, because the mountain had a reputation, and the reputation had a name. Garrick Vane, 34 years old, 6 feet and 3 inches of scar tissue, rope muscle, and barely contained fury. He'd been on that mountain so long the seasonal trappers who worked the lower ridges spoke about him the way children spoke about wolves, not quite believing he was real until the evidence showed up dead in the snow. 3 years prior, a man named Corbin Stolt had climbed Black Ridge to challenge Garrick over a disputed boundary marker. Corbin came back down alone and on foot, missing 2 teeth and his horse. He never explained exactly what happened. He didn't have to. The way his hand shook when someone mentioned the ridge told the story well enough. That was Garrick Vane's reputation in cold water crossing. The settlement of 400 souls that sat at the base of the mountain like a rock that had rolled down and gotten stuck. It was a hard town. Timber work and fur trade, a general store that doubled as a tavern after sundown, one physician who was better with horses than humans, and a social hierarchy built almost entirely on who owned what land and who owed whom money. The Quinns owed money to practically everyone. Marlowe Quinn found out about the arrangement the way she found out about most things affecting her life. Second-hand, too late, and from a source that thought it was funny. She was in the back of Hollis Draper's general store, hauling a crate of dried saltfish from the rear stockroom to the front counter, when she heard her name come through the wall partition thin enough to be practically decorative. Quinn girl, the big one. No. A pause, a laugh. You're not serious. I'm telling you what I heard at the council meeting last Thursday. The first voice again, she placed it as Pema Ratch, a woman who used gossip the way a carpenter used a hammer, constantly and without much precision. They've decided Garrick Vane needs a wife to stabilize the trade agreements on the Northern Passage. Apparently, his land sits on the only practical route through to the Kelbourne settlements, and they picked her. Who else would they pick? Every respectable family in Coldwater already refused. You think the Aldermans are sending their daughter up that ridge, or the Prescotts? Another laugh, shorter, crueler. She's got no one to refuse on her behalf. Father's dead, no brothers. She works for Hollis for room and board. Town council made a decision, and that's that. Marlowe set the crate down on the counter with a thump that was louder than she intended. The conversation on the other side of the partition stopped. She straightened, smoothed her work apron, and walked to the front of the store with her face arranged into an expression that gave nothing away. That night she sat on the edge of her cot in the small room above the store that Hollis Draper generously called staff quarters, and less generously furnished with a straw mattress, one wool blanket, and a window that let in more cold than light. She had a candle burning low on the windowsill. She didn't read. She didn't cry. She sat with her hands on her knees and thought very carefully about her situation, which was her habit when the world presented her with problems she hadn't chosen. Marlowe Quinn was 26 years old. She was heavy-set in a way that Coldwater Crossing had decided meant something about her character. Lazy, people assumed, or indulgent, or somehow less than women who wore smaller dresses. Never mind that she worked 12 hours a day for Hollis Draper and had, in the past year alone, renegotiated his supplier contracts to save him $40 by writing letters he couldn't have written himself. Never mind that she could read and calculate figures faster than most men in town, and had quietly kept the store's books accurate while Hollis took credit for the results. None of that was visible. What was visible was her body, and Coldwater Crossing had made its opinion of that very clear. She'd been passed over for marriage twice already, not because she was unkind or difficult or unsuitable in any practical sense. Both men, when pressed by their mothers, had eventually admitted they worried about what people would say about them for choosing her. So now the town council had decided to use her as a solution to a political problem. She should have been furious. Part of her was, but another part, a calculating, clear-eyed part that she'd had to develop early and sharpen constantly just to get through ordinary life in this town, was already thinking past the fury to the question of what exactly the situation actually offered. Land. Garrick Vane's land on Black Ridge wasn't just a mountain. It was the only viable northern passage to the Kelbourne settlements, where there was real commerce, timber contracts, mining operations, a growing population that needed goods from the south. Whoever controlled that passage controlled a significant piece of regional trade. The town council wanted stable access. The land syndicate, she'd heard that name floating around too, though nobody ever named them directly, wanted the land outright. If she married Garrick Vane and made it work, she wouldn't be a charity case anymore. She wouldn't be the woman Hollis Draper let sleep above his store in exchange for labor that was worth 3 times what he paid her. She'd be a landowner. She'd have standing. The candle guttered. She pinched it out and lay back in the dark, staring at the ceiling where the boards were pulling apart at the seams. Let's see what the mountain's worth, she thought, and went to sleep. Chapter 2. What everyone said about him. In the weeks before Marlowe's departure, Coldwater Crossing did what Coldwater Crossing always did. When it had an audience for cruelty, it performed. The women at the market were the worst, not loudly, not in a way that invited direct confrontation, just quietly, with the sideways precision of people who had learned how to wound without leaving marks. Poor creature, said Dana Ellsworth to her friend Greta at the vegetable stalls, in a voice pitched exactly loud enough for Marlowe to hear from the next table over. Imagine being so desperate they'd send you up to him. I heard he broke a man's collarbone once with one hand. Greta's voice dropped to theatrical concern, just because the man crossed onto his property line. She should run, Dana said, while she still can. Marlowe was examining a turnip at the time. She turned it over in her hands, set it back, and moved on to the carrots without comment. At Hollis Draper's store, old Pal Maddock, 70 years old, former trapper, the kind of man who believed his age entitled him to say anything, leaned on the counter while Marlowe tallied his tab and said, "You know what happened to the last girl they sent up there?" Marlowe said, without looking up from the ledger. She came back. She came back in pieces, emotionally speaking. Pell tapped the counter with one gnarled finger, ran screaming down the mountain trail at midnight, took her weeks to stop shaking. And before her there was a girl from Alderton, stayed 3 days. 3. He held up fingers. Before she decided sleeping in the woods in November was preferable. Is there a point to the story, Pell, or are you practicing your ghost tales for the tavern? He blinked. I'm warning you. Your tab comes to $2.14. Will you be paying in coin or credit? Pell stared at her for a moment. Then he fished in his coat pocket with an expression of profound confusion, as if he'd been expecting a different reaction, and wasn't sure what to do with the one he'd gotten. What Marlowe actually knew about Garrick Vane was modest and mostly third-hand. She knew he'd been born in the valley, not on the mountain, the son of a trapper who'd worked the northern ranges for 30 years and eventually been granted a deed to the Black Ridge territory in lieu of debts owed by a settlement official who didn't have coin to spare. Garrick had grown up on that land, had built most of the homestead himself, starting when he was 17, and his father's health had started failing. She knew he'd been married once, briefly, A woman from further north, she'd heard the name Susanna spoken in hushed tones once at the town hall social 3 years ago, before the speaker noticed Marlowe was within earshot and stopped talking. Whatever had happened with Susanna was clearly a wound that Coldwater Crossing considered too interesting to share directly and too dramatic to drop entirely. She knew he'd had legitimate disputes with the town, over land boundary surveys, over access rights, over the council's repeated attempts to reclassify portions of his property for public use purposes that would have benefited specific merchants more than the public. He'd won all of them. The town hadn't forgiven him for it. And she knew, because she had eyes and could observe, that the current arrangement, this marriage agreement, had been constructed primarily to benefit people who stood to gain from Garrick losing his mountain. The trade agreement framing was convenient cover. If she married him, came back down immediately claiming he was violent or unstable, there would be grounds for legal intervention. His land could be seized. The Northern Passage could be regulated. She'd worked that out in 3 days of thinking quietly, while she restocked shelves and kept her expression pleasant. The question was, did Garrick Vane know the same thing? Chapter 3. The morning she climbed. The council gave her a horse, a wagon, half loaded with supplies, and a letter of introduction that she didn't read until she was already on the trail, and could confirm nobody from town was watching. The letter, written in Council Chairman Bray Hollister's cramped official hand, introduced her as a woman of Coldwater Crossing, offered in the spirit of community alliance and frontier cooperation. There was no mention of her name until the 3rd paragraph, and even then it was misspelled. Marlowe Quinn, not Marlowe. She folded the letter, put it in her coat pocket, and kept moving. The trail up to Black Ridge was not technically a road, it was a suggestion. A series of choices that horses had apparently made repeatedly over many years until something resembling a path had formed. In November, with the first serious snow of the season down, and the sky the color of old pewter, it was also an education in what winter actually meant at elevation. The horse, a solid brown mare she'd been calling Rust in her head since they'd met, was more sensible than the trail deserved. Marlowe walked beside her for the steepest sections rather than adding her weight to the load on unstable ground. Her boots were good ones. She'd traded Hollis Draper 3 weeks of bookkeeping she hadn't been technically obligated to complete in exchange for the best pair in his dry goods stock. He'd complained about the cost while handing them over, which told her the trade was fair. She'd packed methodically, extra wool layers, a good knife because she wasn't naive, dried food that would last 2 weeks without resupply, seeds, not many but carefully chosen for elevation and short growing seasons, because whoever had last managed the garden at the Black Ridge homestead had clearly done so with no particular knowledge or interest. She'd asked Old Pell, whose years of trapping had given him detailed knowledge of the Northern Territory, what the soil was like up there. He'd been so surprised she was asking a practical question instead of expressing fear that he'd answered honestly and in useful detail. She knew the approach to the homestead from Pell's description, a flat stone shelf about 800 feet below the true ridge peak, south-facing to catch maximum winter sunlight, with timber stands to the east that broke the worst wind. She knew the main structure was a log building, 2 rooms, a separate woodshed that may or may not still be standing depending on the last few winters. What she didn't know was exactly what Garrick Vane would do when she arrived. She thought about that for a while as the trail steepened. He would probably be hostile. She accounted for that. He'd been sent brides before who'd fled at first sight, which meant he'd learned to expect abandonment and had constructed his behavior accordingly, probably in ways that felt to him like protection and that looked to everyone else like confirmation of the monster stories. A man who expected rejection learned to reject first. She understood that architecture. She'd lived a version of it herself. "All right, Rust," she said to the horse, who had paused at a steep section and was reconsidering her life choices. "Neither of us asked for this, but here we are." She patted the mare's nose. 1 step. Rust stepped. Chapter 4. First Sight. She heard him before she saw him, not his voice, a sound, an axe, striking with a precision and force that turned the normal rhythm of wood splitting into something almost mechanical. Crack, pause, crack, pause, regular as a clock. She counted the interval, 4 seconds between strikes. Either he was extraordinarily methodical or extraordinarily strong, because 4 seconds to reset, position and swing with that much force was not typical. She came around the last bend in the trail and the homestead opened up in front of her. It was in worse condition than she'd expected and better condition than some of the stories had suggested. The main building stood solid, logs fitted tightly, chinking intact, no visible rot on the corners she could see. The roof needed work on the eastern pitch where 2 sections of bark shingle had shifted and left a gap. The woodshed was standing but leaning. The fence posts around what had been a kitchen garden was still there, but the wire between them was gone, probably taken by weather. The well cover was cracked. Garrick Vane was at the woodpile, which was substantial, which told her he was at least competent at basic survival, even if nothing else was in order. He stopped when he heard Rust's hooves on the frozen ground. He didn't turn immediately. He set the axe head down against the chopping block, both hands still on the handle, and appeared to be deciding something. Then he turned. The first thing she noticed was that the stories hadn't exaggerated his size. He was exactly as physically imposing as reported, wide through the shoulders in a way that looked structural rather than decorative. Hands that had clearly been used for hard labor for so long, they'd reshaped themselves accordingly. The scar on his jaw was visible from 20 feet, a ridge of silver-white tissue running from below his left ear to his chin. His hair was dark and overlong, pushed back from his face by the cold. His eyes were a color she couldn't quite name from this distance, brown or gray, or some combination of the two that the flat winter light wasn't helping clarify. He looked at her. She looked at him. He looked at the horse and the wagon. He looked at her again. "No," he said. The word dropped into the cold air like the axe into wood. Flat. Final. Not angry. Worse than angry, somehow. The tone of a man who has rehearsed this moment in his head enough times that the emotion has been entirely wrung out of it. Marlowe tied Rust's reins to the nearest fence post and climbed down from the wagon with the careful movements of someone who had been sitting in the cold for 3 hours and didn't intend to pull a muscle in front of a stranger. "I'm Marlowe Quinn," she said, "from Coldwater Crossing." "I know who you are." He picked up the axe and turned back to the woodpile. "Go back. I've been walking since dawn, and I'd like water and somewhere warm to stand for a few minutes before we decide anything." He split a log without turning around. The pieces flew apart with violent efficiency. "You'll leave the same as the others," he said. "That's possible." She turned and started lifting a supply crate out of the wagon. "But I didn't come empty-handed, and I'm not going anywhere until I've had something to drink." I didn't help her unload. She didn't ask him to. She made 4 trips from the wagon to the main building's front step, stacking the crates and bundles in an organized row. Garrick split wood through all of it, his back to her, maintaining a consistency that she recognized not as indifference but as determined ignorance. He didn't want to know she was organized. He didn't want to notice that she'd brought good supplies. He was trying very hard to experience her arrival as an event that had already ended. Eventually he ran out of logs to split. He stood at the empty chopping block for a moment, axe in hand, and then turned, because there was no longer a reason not to. She was sitting on the front step of the main building, eating a piece of dried meat, hands wrapped around a tin cup she'd apparently located, filled, and heated without going inside. There was a small camp stove set up on one of the supply crates. Not a fancy piece of equipment, just a collapsible iron frame with a burner that used compressed fuel, and a second cup sitting beside it, also steaming. He stared at the second cup. "I didn't know how you take it," she said, "so there's nothing in it, but it's hot." He didn't move. "You can tell me to go to hell," she said. "That's fine. I've heard worse this week." She gestured at the second cup with her chin. "But drink it first, because your hands are going to lock up if you stay out here much longer without warming them." A very long pause. Garrick Vane walked to the front step, picked up the second cup and stood 6 feet away from her drinking it, not sitting, standing with his weight distributed in the posture of someone who was making clear this was a temporary position. Marlowe ate her dried meat and didn't say anything. After a while he said, in a tone that sounded like it had been built to be threatening, but had lost something in transit, "You're not what they usually send." "What do they usually send?" His jaw worked. "Frightened girls." "I can see how that would be an unpleasant experience for everyone." He looked at her sideways. "You're not frightened." "I didn't say that." She finished the dried meat, folded the cloth it had been wrapped in, and tucked it back in her pocket. "I said I wasn't going anywhere until I had something to drink." She looked up at the homestead's front face, the gap in the eastern roof pitch, the cracked window shutter on the left side. "Your roof is losing heat through that east section. You'll want to address it before the next serious snowfall, or you'll have ice building up in the rafters." He turned and looked at the roof as if seeing it for the first time. Then he turned back and looked at her with an expression that was not friendliness. She wasn't fool enough to call it that, but was, at minimum, something other than the flat dismissal he'd opened with. "The inside's not—" He started again. "I didn't expect—" He stopped again. "Anyone to actually arrive?" she said. Something shifted in his face. Fast gone before she could catalogue it fully. But it had been there. "Come in," he said. Andy. Chapter 5. What the inside said. The interior of the Black Ridge homestead told her more about Garrick Vane in 30 seconds than the entire town of Coldwater Crossing had managed in a week of warnings. The main room was functional, and that was the most generous thing she could say about it. A stone fireplace against the interior wall, well built, clearly the work of someone who knew what they were doing. A heavy table, 2 chairs mismatched in height, a set of shelves holding tools and supplies arranged with the specific, practical logic of someone who lived alone and had organized everything according to their own system. A second room, she could see through the doorway, held a sleeping area that was spare to the point of austerity. No decorations, no gestures toward comfort, nothing that hadn't been placed there because it served an immediate function. But the shelves. She stood in front of them, reading their organization because it was information. The tools were maintained, not just functional, maintained with real care, the kind of attention that meant he respected what they did for him. A trap mechanism she could see from across the room was clean and properly tensed, which required patience and precision, and a knowledge of what a poorly maintained trap meant in terms of survival consequences. The firewood stacked beside the hearth was good wood, properly seasoned, sized consistently, not random pieces grabbed in a hurry. Someone had thought about burn rate and heat output, and on the lower shelf, half tucked behind a box of nails, 3 books. Their spines were worn enough that she couldn't read the titles from where she stood. Garrick had come in behind her and was standing in the middle of the room watching her look at his things. She could feel the tension in him from 6 feet away, the waiting for judgment. "Your trap maintenance is excellent," she said. He blinked. "What?" "The mechanism on that trap." She nodded toward it. "It's been cleaned recently, and the spring tension is set correctly. That's not a 5-minute job." A very long pause. "You know about traps." "I know about most things that are written down somewhere." She turned and looked at him directly. "And I read a great deal." He had nothing to do with that information. She could see him filing it away somewhere, behind the wall he'd built to keep everything at distance. "There are 2 rooms," he said. "You can—" "The second room is—" He stopped. "I'll need somewhere to put my things," she said. "And then I'd like to look at that roof before the light goes." "You're not going on the roof." "Why not?" "Because it's icy and you'll fall." "I won't fall," she paused, "but I'll accept help if you're offering." He hadn't been offering. The expression on his face made that clear. But now he was in the position of either refusing assistance to a person who would then go on a potentially dangerous roof without it, or providing assistance, which wasn't what he wanted. He picked up his coat from the hook beside the door. "I'll get the ladder," he said. Chapter 6. The first night they worked on the roof until the last usable light faded out of the sky. Garrick didn't talk much. Marlowe didn't push for conversation. She watched how he worked, efficient, no wasted movement, a practical intelligence in the way he approached each problem that had clearly been developed entirely outside of formal education, but was no less real for that. He handed her materials without being asked, because he assessed what she needed before she reached for it, which meant he was watching her work as carefully as she was watching his. She replaced 12 shingles. He replaced 9, and reseated the flashing along the peak that had been the root cause of the shifting. They finished in silence and climbed back down in silence, and when they went inside he built the fire up without comment, and she started a pot of something for supper from her supplies without asking permission. He sat at the table. She cooked. The fire made the room bearable. "You've cooked on a hearth before," he said. "Not a question." "Since I was 8. She adjusted the pot's position. "My mother believed domestic skills were practical rather than decorative. She taught me to cook, build a fire, set a bone, and negotiate a contract before she died." She paused. "In roughly that order of priority." His silence had different weights to it, she was learning. This one was less hostile than the earlier versions. "How old were you?" he said. "When she died, 14. She stirred the pot. "My father lasted 2 more years. After that it was managing on my own." She'd said it matter-of-factly because it was a matter of fact. It wasn't a story she told for sympathy. She'd long since used up whatever desire she'd ever had to extract sympathy from people who demonstrated they had none to give. The pot bubbled. Outside, the wind had picked up and the homestead's walls absorbed it without complaint. Good construction, she noted for the 4th time. "There was a woman before you," Garrick said. He was looking at the table. 2 women. Before her, 1 other. "I know. The whole town knows." She lifted the pot and carried it to the table. "I'm not interested in competing with their decisions. People leave when staying feels impossible. That's not a character failing. That's survival." He looked up. She set a bowl in front of him. It was a simple stew. Dried beans, salt pork, 2 of the root vegetables she'd bought in cold water, pepper. Nothing remarkable, hot. "Why didn't you leave," he said, "at the woodpile when I told you to go?" She sat down across from him and picked up her spoon. "Because going back to Coldwater Crossing with nothing to show for it would have meant spending the rest of my working life in Hollis Draper's stockroom," she said. "And that's a worse fate than a cold mountain." It wasn't the whole truth. It wasn't a lie either. He looked at the bowl. He picked up his spoon. "It needs salt," he said after the first bite. "The salt is on the shelf behind you." He got up and got the salt. He sat back down. He ate. Outside, Black Ridge settled into its winter darkness. Snow beginning to fall again in the thin, determined way it fell at elevation. Not in a hurry, not dramatic, just relentlessly accumulating, covering everything that wasn't actively defended against it. In the homestead the fire burned. The 2 people at the table ate their supper in a silence that was, for the first time since Marlowe had arrived, almost peaceable. Not comfortable, not safe, not anything that could be called easy, but not hostile either. And on a mountain where the weather was trying to kill you and the people below wanted what you had, and everything you'd built was under some form of constant pressure, not hostile, was worth something. It was a start. Even if neither of them said so, even if both of them suspected, privately and separately, that whatever came next was going to be harder than anything the night had already asked of them. The snow kept falling, the fire kept burning. Marlowe Quinn ate her stew, and planned her next 7 days with the methodical clarity that had kept her alive this long, and would, she intended, continue to do so, on this mountain or anywhere else the world decided to put her. 3 days passed before Garrick stopped watching the trail. It wasn't something he announced. It was something Marlowe noticed. The way his attention, which had been angled toward the southern path every morning like a habit he couldn't break, gradually shifted inward to the homestead itself. By the 4th morning he was watching the sky instead, reading the weather the way men who'd lived at elevation long enough learned to read it. Not just cloud cover and wind direction, but the specific texture of the cold, the smell of pressure dropping, the way sound carried differently when snow was coming, versus when it had already come and settled. He still didn't trust her. That was fine. She wasn't asking for trust. She was asking for time, and time was something the mountain provided in abundance, whether you wanted it or not. The roof held through the first real snowfall, which came on the 5th night with the kind of seriousness that separated November from the months before it. Marlowe woke at 2 in the morning to the sound of it. Not the snow itself, but the wind that drove it, a sustained pressure against the western wall that made the logs shift and breathe. She lay in the narrow bed in the second room and listened to the building absorb the storm, and in the gaps between gusts she could hear faintly Garrick moving in the main room, stoking the fire, not sleeping. She got up. He was standing at the window when she came through the doorway, a blanket over his shoulders, looking out at nothing, because the snow and the dark had fused into a single wall of white-black. He didn't turn when she entered, but the tension in his shoulders changed slightly. A small adjustment, the body acknowledging without the mind deciding to. Marlowe went to the fire and added 2 logs without asking. She pulled the second chair close to the hearth and sat down. After a moment, Garrick turned from the window and sat in the other chair. "Storm will run through by morning," he said. "I know. I could hear it changing direction about an hour ago." He looked at her sideways. "I grew up at the edge of the valley," she said, "near the North Fork. Before my parents died, we had a farm there that caught every storm coming down off the ridge before it hit the settlements. I know what a passing storm sounds like versus one that's sitting on you." He was quiet for a moment. The fire cracked and shifted. "Most people from town don't know anything about reading weather. Most people from town don't need to." She stretched her hands toward the heat. Her knuckles ached in the cold. They always did, had since a winter 3 years ago when she'd worked the store's unheated stockroom through December with inadequate gloves. Small damage, permanent. They have buildings and other people and stores that stay stocked. The mountain teaches different things. Garrick turned something over in his hands. She realized it was a small carving, rough-edged, the shape of an animal she couldn't identify in the firelight. His hands worked on it without seeming to notice they were doing it. A reflexive motion, the kind built from years of repetition. "You're not what I expected," he said. The words came out at a cost. She could hear the effort of it. "What did you expect?" "Someone I'd have to convince to leave." He set the carving on the arm of the chair. "Or someone who'd convinced herself this was a rescue story, that they were going to fix me." The last word had acid in it, old and corroded. "I'm not here to fix you," Marlowe said. "I'm here because my options were limited and yours were being made worse by people who benefit from your isolation." She paused. "That's not romantic, but it's honest." Something in his face moved. Not quite a smile, more like the memory of one briefly visiting. "The others talked about what I could become," he said, "if I tried harder, if I came back down, if I made an effort to be—" He turned the carving over again, more acceptable. "That sounds exhausting." It was. He looked at the fire. "Susanna," he stopped, started again on different footing. "My wife. She came here thinking she could pull me down the mountain through sheer force of wanting it badly enough. She was from a good family. She wanted a normal life, and she thought that was something she could build anywhere if she worked hard enough at it." His jaw tightened. "Took her 8 months to decide this wasn't anywhere. It was nowhere." The wind hit the west wall and held for a long count before releasing. "I'm sorry," Marlowe said. "Don't be. She was right. This is—" He gestured at the room, the walls, the window full of storm. "This is a hard life. Harder than most people want when they see it clearly. I see it clearly." He looked at her directly. Not with warmth. She didn't expect that, not yet, maybe not for a long time, but with something that was at least in the same territory as respect. "Why does it not scare you?" She considered the honest answer, which was complicated, and then gave him a version of it. "Because I've already been somewhere that felt like nowhere. Cold water crossing for a woman in my position, with no family and no land and no husband. That's its own kind of nowhere. At least up here the walls are solid." He was quiet for a long time after that. The storm made its noise. The fire did its work. When he finally spoke again, it was about the woodshed. The lean he'd noticed worsening on the west side. What he thought the cause was what materials he'd need to correct it come spring. Practical, impersonal. The exact kind of conversation a man has when he's been moved by something and needs to talk about something else entirely. Marlowe answered him practically. She had thoughts about the foundation, which she'd examined on her second day. He listened. They talked about the woodshed for 40 minutes, and by the time they ran out of things to say about it, the storm had shifted direction as she'd predicted, and the worst was moving through. Garrick banked the fire and went back to his room. Marlowe went back to hers. She lay in the dark and thought, he doesn't trust me yet, but he isn't pretending I'm not here. That's something. It was something. By the end of the second week she had a system, not a perfect one. The kitchen garden was a problem she couldn't solve until spring, and the storage situation for their food supply needed rethinking, because whoever had organized it last hadn't accounted for the specific moisture problems in the lower shelf area near the floor, which meant 2 bags of grain were compromised. She'd caught it before the damage spread, which Garrick acknowledged by saying nothing, and then reorganizing the lower shelves. The following afternoon, with a different spacing arrangement that addressed the airflow problem. How they expressed approval through action rather than language, she was beginning to understand that. She fixed the broken window shutter. He watched her assess it for 20 minutes and then handed her the correct tools before she asked for them. She repaired the fence post around the kitchen garden, not because there was anything to grow yet, but because the infrastructure needed to exist before it could be used. He replaced the missing wire without being asked, and when she looked up from her work to find him doing it, he just raised his eyebrows as if to say, obviously, and went back to the task. The silences between them were shifting. Not all of them. Some were still loaded with the particular tension of 2 people who didn't yet know whether the other was trustworthy and were monitoring constantly for evidence either way. But some had become functional. Working silences, the kind that developed between people who were cooperating on problems that required attention. It was on a Tuesday, 14 days since her arrival, that he came inside at midday to find her at the table with his papers spread out in front of her. He stopped in the doorway. "What are you doing?" he said. Not a question exactly, more an accusation waiting to hear the response before deciding its precise nature. "Reading your land documents," she said. She didn't look up. She'd been expecting this moment and had decided in advance to handle it as directly as possible. The original deed, the boundary survey from 12 years ago, and what I'm fairly certain is an illegal resurvey document that someone filed in Coldwater's records office approximately 3 years ago. Now she looked up. "Did you know about the resurvey?" He came into the room. His expression was doing several things at once. "What resurvey?" "Sit down, I'll stand. Garrick." She used his name for the first time without the faint formality she'd maintained up till then. "Sit down, because this is going to take a few minutes to explain, and you're going to want to be sitting when you hear it." A long beat. He sat. She turned the papers so they faced him and pointed to the resurvey document, a dense page of legal language and coordinates that would have been effectively opaque to someone who hadn't spent 2 years quietly teaching themselves property law from a copy of Alderman's Guide to Frontier Land Rights that she'd found in Hollis Draper's back room and worked through in the evenings after the store closed. "See this line?" She traced a coordinate boundary. "According to the original deed, your northern property edge runs along the natural stone formation they called the Grey Break. It's unambiguous. It's been on record for 30 years. She moved her finger to the second document. "This resurvey redraws the northern boundary approximately 400 feet south of the Grey Break, which puts the northern passage, the main access route to the Kelbourne settlements, outside your legal territory." Garrick stared at the document. The muscle in his jaw had gone tight. "Who filed this?" he said. "The filing name is a company called Vantage Land Partners." She leaned back. "I'd never heard of them before I came up here, but I've been thinking about it for 4 days and I think they're local. The language in this document, specific phrases, the way certain clauses are constructed, matches the way Bray Hollister writes when he's trying to sound more official than he is." She paused. I've read enough of Hollister's council documents to know his patterns. Garrick was very still. You're telling me the council chairman is trying to steal my land. I'm telling you someone filed a document that would legally justify claiming your land is smaller than your deed says it is. And whoever arranged my marriage contract and sent me up here, she met his eyes. They were counting on me to fail, to come back down and give them a reason to declare this homestead abandoned or ungovernable. That triggers a different set of laws about disputed frontier properties. The silence that followed was not the working kind. It was the kind that precedes a decision. Garrick stood up. He went to the window. His hands were at his sides, not fists. Worse than fists somehow, because fists were a response, and this was contained fury looking for a shape. I should have looked harder at those papers, he said. 3 years ago when he stopped. You were dealing with other things 3 years ago, Marlowe said carefully. His shoulders dropped about a quarter inch. Susanna left in November of that year. I wasn't looking at land documents. Nobody expects I should have. He turned. His face was controlled in the way faces became controlled when the alternative was worse. What do we do? It was we. She noted it and didn't make anything of it out loud. First we make copies of everything, she said, both documents. I'll write them in my hand so they can't be confused with the originals. Then we establish the discrepancy clearly, which I can do because I have the coordinate knowledge and can do the calculation to demonstrate what the boundary difference actually means in terms of terrain. She tapped the papers. And then we need to know who exactly is behind Vantage Land Partners, because a resurvey filing requires witnesses and a licensed surveyor's signature. There are real names attached to this somewhere. I was looking at her with an expression she hadn't seen from him before. Not warmth. She'd stopped expecting that on any predictable timeline. But something adjacent to it, something that looked like a person reconsidering a position they'd held for a long time. You know law, he said, self-taught from one book, but yes. Why? She was quiet for a moment, deciding on the honest version. Because no one was going to explain my rights to me. Nobody explains rights to women in my position. You either figure it out yourself or you spend your life subject to other people's decisions about what's yours. She gathered the papers into a careful stack. I prefer to know. Garrick Vane looked at Marlowe Quinn for a long, steady moment. Then he pulled out the second chair, the one that had always been his, turned it around backward, and sat down with his arms across the back of it. Show me, he said, all of it, from the beginning. So she did. They sat at that table until the afternoon light failed, and the room went grey, and then he built the fire up without being asked, and she kept talking, walking him through every document, every discrepancy, every implication she'd worked out over 4 days of quiet, careful reading. He asked questions that were better than she expected. Sharp, practical, focused on the things that mattered rather than the things that felt dramatic. I didn't interrupt when she was making a point, and he didn't pretend to understand things he didn't, which she respected more than any amount of false confidence would have earned. By the time they ate supper, the situation had been mapped. Not solved. They didn't have enough information yet about Vantage Land Partners, and the route to challenging the resurvey legally would require getting to Coldwater's records office without giving anyone advance notice, but mapped, named, given shape. The problem had edges now, and a problem with edges was a different category of thing than a problem that just pressed on you from all sides without definition. Garrick washed the bowls after supper. He did it without ceremony, without comment, the way he did all the small domestic tasks that needed doing, as if function was its own justification. Marlowe sat at the table and wrote out her coordinate calculations for the third time to make sure they were right. You're good at this, he said from the wash basin. At math, at not panicking. She looked up. His back was to her, still working the bowl. Years of practice, she said. He dried his hands and turned around. In the firelight, the scar along his jaw was less stark than in daylight. Just a line, part of a face that had been through things and carried them forward. We'll figure it out, he said. Not you'll figure it out or I'll handle it, we. Yes, Marlowe said, we will. Outside, the mountain was perfectly quiet in the way it got after a hard cold settled in. No wind, no movement, just the deep particular silence of elevation and snow and distance from everywhere else. Inside, two people who hadn't chosen each other and hadn't yet decided what to make of each other sat with the same set of problems between them and the same uneasy, unspoken understanding that what came next was going to require more than either of them alone. It wasn't comfort, it wasn't safety, but it was the two of them and the mountain and the truth laid out on the table between them. That was enough to work with. The copies took 3 days. Marlowe wrote every document twice in 2 different hands, one that matched her natural writing, clean and precise, and one she'd developed years ago for situations where she needed something to look unofficial and handwritten rather than calculated. She wasn't sure yet which version would be more useful. She made both. Garrick watched her work without comment, which was his version of paying attention. On the second day he brought her coffee without being asked and set it beside the papers with the specific care of someone who understood that what she was doing mattered and didn't want to disturb it. She said thank you without looking up. He went back to sharpening a trap mechanism at the other end of the table. They had developed a rhythm in those 3 weeks that neither of them had named, and both of them were aware of. It wasn't comfortable. There were still hours when the tension between them had a physical quality, when one wrong word would have cracked something that hadn't fully set yet. But the rhythm was real. Morning chores divided without discussion, based on who was better at what and who needed to be somewhere else. Meals shared at the same table. Conversation that had started as purely functional and had developed gradually the occasional unguarded edge. He told her about the bear, for instance. 3rd week without preamble, while they were both eating breakfast and looking out the window at the tree line. There was a black bear, he said, that had been working the eastern property edge for 2 seasons. Enormous, older, one ear partially torn from some encounter he hadn't witnessed. He'd seen it 11 times. It had seen him approximately 4 of those based on its behavior. He'd named it Argument because it always seemed to be having one with the landscape. Marlowe had laughed. Actually laughed, not the polite social version she deployed in town, but the real kind, short and sudden. Garrick had looked startled and then, briefly, quickly, pleased with himself in a way that he immediately buried under a neutral expression. That had been 3 days before she finished the document copies. On the morning of the 4th day, she folded everything into an oilcloth packet and looked up to find him already dressed for outside, his heavy coat on, watching her. "I need to go to town," she said. "I know. The records office. I need to see the original filing in person. There'll be a surveyor's signature on the official copy that isn't on the version you have. A name." "I know," he said again. His jaw was set in the way it got when he'd already fought an internal argument and reached a conclusion he didn't entirely like. "I'll come with you." "You don't need to." "Last time I sent someone down that mountain alone," he said. "They didn't come back." He picked up his hat from the hook. "I'm coming." She could have pointed out that the comparison wasn't accurate. She wasn't fleeing. She was pursuing a specific errand with a clear return timeline. She could have argued that his presence in Coldwater Crossing would generate attention that complicated what she needed to do quietly. She was right on both counts, and she knew it, and she also knew, looking at his face, that none of that was why he was coming. I was coming because letting her go alone felt to him like something he'd done before in a different form, and it had cost him. "All right," she said, "but you let me do the talking at the records office." He put his hat on, obviously. The trail down was faster than the trail up. Gravity cooperated in ways that made Marlowe deeply aware of how much work had gone into the climb 3 weeks prior, and she filed that information alongside everything else she was building about Black Ridge's practical realities. Garrick walked ahead on the narrower sections, not because he was leading, but because his legs were longer and he moved at his natural pace without thinking about it. She didn't ask him to slow down. She kept up. He noticed. She caught him checking once, the quick backward glance of a person calibrating, and then he adjusted his pace by half a step without saying anything about it. They reached the valley floor in 2 hours. The settlement of Coldwater Crossing materialized through the tree line in the particular way that settlements did from above, a collection of rooftops and smoke columns that looked organized from a distance and became complicated up close. The reaction was immediate and not subtle. A man outside the feed store saw them coming and went inside without finishing what he'd been doing. 2 women near the market stall stopped talking and tracked Garrick's movement with the focused attention of people observing something they'd been told was dangerous. A child actually ran between 2 buildings, and Marlowe suspected strongly it was to tell someone they were coming, rather than any fear of Garrick specifically. Garrick walked through it with his eyes straight ahead and his expression locked. She recognized the quality of that lock, the practiced blankness of someone who had learned through repetition that showing a reaction only gave people more material to work with. "Is it always like this?" she said low beside him. "Since I was 23, he said, give or take." The records office was a narrow building between the Justice Hall and the surveyor's office, conveniently located, she noted. It was staffed by a thin, anxious man named Terrell Hobbs, whom Marlowe had dealt with twice before in her capacity as Hollis Draper's unofficial bookkeeper. Terrell had always been adequate to his function and more than a little frightened of the world in general. He looked up when they came in, and his face went through 3 expressions in quick succession before settling on something he was trying to make neutral. "Marlowe Quinn," he said, "I heard you went up the—" His eyes moved to Garrick. He stopped. "Hello, Terrell," Marlowe said pleasantly. "I need to see the survey filings for the Black Ridge Territory, specifically anything filed in the last 4 years. Terrell's hands, resting on his desk, did a small, involuntary movement. "Those are— I'd need to check the available." "They're public record," she said, "under Section 12 of the Frontier Property Act. I know because I read it." She set her folded copy of Alderman's Guide to Frontier Land Rights on his desk, with a small, precise thump. Twice. Terrell looked at the book. He looked at her. He looked at Garrick, who was standing 2 feet behind her and saying nothing, which was somehow worse than if he'd been making specific threats. "I'll get the file," Terrell said. I was back in 4 minutes with a folder of papers that he handed to Marlowe with the careful movements of someone diffusing something. She took it to the narrow counter along the wall and started going through it. Garrick positioned himself where he could see the room and the door without obviously watching either. The surveyor's signature on the resurvey document was a man named Holt Cresson. She wrote it down. Below his signature as a witness was a name she recognized immediately and felt, upon recognizing it, a cold clarity settle over her thinking that was better than anger. Aldous Fern, a merchant from the settlement's western edge who ran the largest dry goods operation in Coldwater Crossing, and who had, she knew from Hollis Draper's occasional bitter commentary, been attempting for years to establish exclusive supply contracts with the Kelbourne settlements to the north. Contracts that required reliable passage control. There it was. She photographed it in her memory, copied the relevant details onto her paper, folded everything back exactly as she'd found it, and returned the folder to Terrell's desk, with a thank you that made him look, if anything, more anxious than before. They were 3 steps out of the records office when the voice came from across the street. Well, a carrying voice designed to reach an audience. Look at that. The mountain man and his charity wife come down to civilization. She didn't have to look to know the voice. Aldous Fern was a large man in his late 50s who had built his business on a combination of genuine shrewdness and a talent for making other people feel small. He was standing in front of his store with 2 other men she recognized as being on the town council. Not Hollister, but close enough to Hollister to be significant. Garrick had stopped walking. "Keep moving," Marlowe said quietly for him. "Marlowe." Fern's voice took on a false warmth that was almost impressively unconvincing. "I have to say, I didn't expect you to last this long. We were taking bets, honestly. No offense." "Full offense intended, though," she said without turning around. "We both know that, Aldous." She heard one of the men with him make a surprised sound. Now. Fern stepped off the boardwalk. You should come see me while you're in town. I've been meaning to discuss the access situation on the Northern Passage with someone reasonable, since Vane there. The name landed with the specific weight of someone who had decided to stop pretending. Has always made that particular conversation difficult. Garrick turned around. Marlowe put her hand on his arm. Not grabbing, her fingers just landed there, steady, and pressed once. A signal. He went very still under her hand. I appreciate the offer, she said, turning now, keeping her voice at the exact temperature of someone who has not been affected by any of this. But I'm afraid we have a full schedule today, perhaps another time. Fern's eyes moved between them, reassessing something. His face didn't change exactly, but something behind it did. A slight adjustment, a man recalculating odds. Of course, he said. The invitation stands. She walked. Garrick walked beside her. Neither of them spoke until they were past the market stalls and out of direct sightline of Fern's position. I could have, Garrick started. I know, she said. I know what he was doing. She kept walking. Her hand had dropped from his arm, but she was aware of the space where it had been. He wanted to see if you'd react, give him a public incident, give the council a reason. Garrick's breathing was controlled in the particular way of a person who had been controlling it very deliberately for the past 2 minutes. He's behind the resurvey. He's part of it. He's the commercial interest. Hollister is the legal mechanism. She glanced at him. We have both their names now. He processed this for several steps, then like a pressure valve releasing just enough, you knew going in what you'd find. I suspected. I confirmed. She paused. That's a different thing. He stopped and started again. You think ahead of everything. I think ahead of everything because I've had to. She said it without self-pity. It was just a fact, like the elevation or the temperature. When you don't have size or strength or a family name, you use what you have. I think well and fast, and I remember everything I read. A pause. You're strong, and you know this mountain better than anyone alive. Between us, we're actually fairly well equipped for this situation. I was quiet for a moment. They'd reached the edge of the settlement now. The tree line ahead, the trail beginning its upward argument. Between us, he said. Not a question, more like a man reading a word on a page that he'd seen before but was understanding differently now. Between us, she confirmed. They were halfway up the mountain when the weather changed. Not a storm, something worse than a clean storm, a hard temperature drop, combined with a shifting wind that came off the ridge in gusts that pushed sideways and carried ice crystals that stung on contact. Rust was unhappy about it in the practical, direct way of horses. Head down, pace slower, ears back. Marlowe walked beside her on the steeper sections, as she had on the way down, one hand on the bridle, talking low. Garrick ranged ahead to check the trail condition and came back looking like he'd made a decision about something. The cut through the east face, it's longer, but it's out of the direct wind. This section'll be ice in 20 minutes. Then we take the east cut. He looked at her, then at Rust. The horse'll make it, trails wider. I went ahead to lead them through. The east cut was indeed longer. It added 40 minutes to the return trip, but he was right about the wind, which they could hear rather than feel for most of it. A sustained battering noise against the ridge above that sounded like the mountain arguing with the sky. At a place where the trail widened around a flat stone shelf, Garrick stopped and turned around, not for any reason Marlowe could identify. He just stopped, and when she came up beside him, she saw what he was looking at. Cold water crossing from this angle, at this elevation. Small. The buildings compressed by distance into something that looked almost manageable, almost like a place that couldn't reach you. Smoke from the chimneys rising and then bending sharply in the wind that was tearing across the valley floor. Aldous Fern was down there. Hollister was down there. The resurvey document and all the machinery of whatever plan they'd constructed was down there. They've been at this a while, Garrick said. Not angry at this moment. Something quieter. The survey was 3 years ago, which means they've been building toward this for at least 3 years, maybe more. Probably more, Marlowe said. The Kelbourne settlements have been growing for 5 years. That's when the Northern Passage became valuable enough to be worth scheming over. 5 years. He said it flatly. 5 years of being the obstacle. 5 years of being the problem to be solved, the dangerous inconvenience. The man the town told stories about, to justify whatever they eventually planned to do. They made you the monster, she said, because a monster's land is easier to justify taking than a man's. He looked at her. The wind hit the shelf and she braced against it automatically. Her coat was good, but the cold at this elevation had quality to it, specific, insistent, the kind that found every gap. Come on, he said, another hour of this and the trail'll be difficult. Han gave her his hand at the steepest section. Not with ceremony. Just reached back because the path had gone narrow and icy and it was the practical thing to do. She took it. His hand was extraordinarily warm for someone who'd been outside in December, which she supposed made sense, given the amount of physical work that was his baseline. She didn't think about it beyond that, or told herself she didn't, which was almost the same thing. They made the homestead as the light was fully gone from the sky. Russ settled in her lean-to shelter with extra hay that Garrick had built into the structure with that same particular foresight, planning for hard nights before they arrived. Inside, with the fire built up and supper underway, Marlowe laid out everything she'd confirmed on the table between them, and they went through it methodically. 2 names, Fern Crescent. 1 mechanism, the fraudulent resurvey. 1 goal, access control of the Northern Passage. To challenge it legally, we need to get the original deed in front of someone with jurisdiction, she said, which means a territorial records office, not Coldwater's. The nearest one is Harrow Junction, 3 days' ride. In December. In December. He was quiet for a moment. Or we could wait for spring. We could, she looked at him, and between now and spring they'll know we've seen the filing. Terrell will tell someone. He's not built for secrets. Whatever they're planning, we've accelerated their timeline by going down today. She paused. I'm sorry. I didn't anticipate that consequence well enough. He shook his head. Neither of us thought Fern would be standing on his own boardwalk. I should have planned for Marlowe. He said her name with a directness that stopped her. You found the resurvey. You identified the names. You did it in 3 weeks while learning a homestead and dealing with... He stopped. A small pause. Me. She almost smiled. You weren't the most difficult part. I was difficult. You were manageable. Something crossed his face. Amusement and something more complicated underneath it. Something she noted and set aside because this wasn't the moment for it. What do we do now, he said, which was the 3rd or 4th time he'd asked her that question and had stopped being about land documents several conversations ago. Now we prepare, she said, because they'll come up here eventually. When they decide, waiting is worse than acting. She looked at the walls, the door, the window facing the southern trail. And when they do, I want this mountain to be ready for them. He followed her gaze around the room. Then he looked at her with an expression that she still didn't have a complete name for. Part respect, part something older than respect, the kind of regard that develops not from a single moment, but from an accumulation of small evidences that a person is who they appear to be. Then we prepare, he said. The fire burned. The mountain held its cold silence outside the walls. Below them, in Coldwater Crossing, something was already moving. She could feel it the way she felt weather changing, in the pressure of the air and the quality of things unsaid. They had time, not much and not guaranteed, but some. She intended to use every minute of it. They had 9 days. That was Marlowe's estimate, and she'd built it from observable evidence rather than intuition. Terrell Hobbs would tell someone within 24 hours of their visit, not out of malice, just because the man processed anxiety through conversation and had no mechanism for keeping information pressurized. That someone would be connected to either Fern or Hollister within another day. Factor in the time needed to organize men, manufacture a legal justification, and make the climb in December conditions, and 9 days was the reasonable window. Garrick said 7. She split the difference and they planned for 8. The first thing she did was draw a map. Not of the homestead. Garrick knew the homestead the way she knew the layout of Hollis Draper's store. Without needing to think about it, she drew the approach trails. All of them, including the two that weren't commonly known, that Garrick showed her over 2 evenings of careful description while she sketched and asked questions and made him correct her when she had the angles wrong. There were 3 ways up Black Ridge. The main southern trail, which was the obvious route and the one most people used. The east cut, which she'd learned on their return from town. And a third route, narrow, steep, technically difficult, used historically by trappers who knew the mountain well, that came up through the western rock formation and emerged on the ridge shelf from behind, approaching the homestead from the north rather than the south. Could men on horses use the western route, she asked. Not easily. Maybe not at all in the snow. On foot, yes, if they knew it. Do Fern's people know it? Garrick thought about that. One man might. Holt Cresson, he's done surveys up here twice. He'd know the approach. She added that to the map. So they have 3 possible routes and we have 1 defensible position. The homestead itself. No. She turned the map so he could see it clearly. Not the homestead. The homestead is stone and wood. It can be surrounded. It can be burned. She tapped the map at a point above the structure. The mountain is the defensible position, everything above us. He looked at where her finger rested. The ridge above the stone shelf where the homestead sat was a layered geology of rock formations, outcroppings, loose shale slides, sections where the freeze-thaw cycle over decades had created natural fracture points in the stone faces. Garrick knew every one of them, had lived alongside them so long he'd stopped seeing them as features and thought of them simply as the shape of his home. Marlowe was looking at them differently, as tools. Show me the loose sections, she said, above the southern trail specifically. He showed her over the next 2 days. It was cold, difficult work. Climbing above the homestead in December required preparation and care, and twice she slipped on sections that looked stable and weren't. And both times Garrick caught her arm without making anything of it, and they kept moving. She didn't say thank you, and he didn't expect it. The work was the thing. What she found was better than she'd hoped, and more complicated than she'd wanted. The southern trail, at its steepest section, approximately 300 feet below the homestead, passed directly beneath a rock face that had been slowly losing its argument with gravity for several winters. She could see the stress fractures from 20 feet away, diagonal lines in the stone that caught shadow and ran down to a ledge system where debris had been accumulating season by season. Has this come down before? She asked. Small slides, after heavy rain mostly. Last summer there was one, maybe 10 feet of rock face, came down maybe 30 yards off the trail. And in winter, heavy snow load on top of existing fracture stress. It could come down, he said. He was looking at it with new eyes, significant section of it if the conditions were right, or if someone helped the conditions along. He turned and looked at her with an expression that was not quite alarm and not quite admiration, and existed somewhere in the uncomfortable space between them. You're talking about triggering a controlled slide. Above the trail, timed correctly. She kept her voice even. Not to kill anyone, to block the trail, to stop an armed group from reaching the homestead while we do something else. What's something else? Get the evidence down to people who can see it. She looked at him. If armed men come up here and something happens, if Fern can frame it as you initiating violence, we lose. Everything. The land, the legal case, everything. She looked back at the rock face. But if we can delay them long enough and get the documents and the resurvey discrepancy in front of witnesses who aren't on Hollister's payroll, who would those witnesses be? It was the right question, and the one she'd been working on for 3 days. The Kelbourne settlers, she said, the ones who actually use the Northern Passage. They have direct economic interest in the access rights staying with you rather than moving to Fern's operation. They're not controlled by Cold Waters Council, and there are enough of them that their testimony at a territorial records office would carry weight. Garrick was quiet for a long moment. The wind came off the upper ridge and both of them leaned into it without thinking about it. You'd need to get word to them, he said. I know a man who trades with the Kelbourne settlements. Pell Maddock, she paused. He talks too much and he tried to frighten me before I came up here, but he's not dishonest and he goes north twice a winter. If I can get him a letter and a reason, he'd do it for money. He'd do it for money, she agreed, which we don't have much of. I have some, saved. He said it the way he said most things about himself, flatly, without elaboration. Not a lot. How much? He told her. It was enough, not comfortable, but enough. I'll write the letter tonight, she said. She was already climbing back down toward the homestead when he said behind her, Marlowe. She stopped and looked back up at him. He was standing against the rock face, the sky behind him the pewter grey of a December afternoon, and he looked, for the first time since she'd arrived, like someone who was about to say something he didn't have a prepared version of. When I told you to go, he said, that first day, at the woodpile. He stopped. I remember. I meant it. He held her gaze. I want you to know I'm aware of that I meant it and I was wrong. She looked at him for a moment. You were protecting yourself. I was being a coward dressed up as someone too dangerous to bother. The honesty of it landed solidly, the way honest things did, when a person wasn't used to offering them. She didn't make it easy or dismiss it. She let it be what it was. You weren't wrong about everything, she said. I did come up here for reasons that had nothing to do with you. I know, you told me. A pause. You're the first person I can think of who's told me true things they didn't have to. She turned that over. Then she started back down the slope. Write that down so I can embarrass you with it later, she said. Behind her, she heard something that might have been a laugh. Brief, rough around the edges, like something that hadn't been used in a while. It was a good sound. The letter to Pell Maddock took 4 drafts. The first was too formal, the kind of language that made people feel they were being used rather than trusted. The second overcorrected and came out folksy in a way that would make Pell suspicious because he knew she wasn't folksy. The third was the right tone but missed a crucial practical detail. The fourth she sealed and handed to Garrick with instructions on where Pell could usually be found at this time of year. You're not taking it yourself, he said. I need to be here. She looked at the map on the table. If Cresson knows the western route, we have to address it before we address the southern trail, and I can't do both at once. He left before dawn the following morning. She stood in the doorway and watched the trail until his shape dissolved into the dark, and then she went inside, because watching after someone was a feeling she didn't entirely trust herself with yet. She spent the day alone on the mountain doing the work she'd described to him, and some additional work she hadn't mentioned because she hadn't wanted to argue about it before it was done. The western route was narrower and more technically demanding than the southern trail, and Cresson or no Cresson, it was also the one that came in from behind. A group entering from the south could be seen and heard in advance. A group coming through the western formation in the dark on foot could reach the homestead in silence. She spent 4 hours in the cold, working a specific problem along the western approach, a snow-loaded ledge system above the narrowest section of the route, where the path compressed between 2 rock walls for approximately 30 feet. The ledge above it held several seasons of accumulated snow, compacted by freeze-thaw cycles into something much heavier than fresh powder. The fracture point was already present, a horizontal crack in the ledge's base that would, given the right addition of weight or vibration at the right location. She identified the location. She noted the trigger point. She did not trigger it. She came back inside with frozen hands and a sore shoulder from where she'd caught herself on a descent, and she ate cold food rather than take the time to heat anything, and she fell asleep at the table over her notes. She woke up to Garrick coming through the door. It was evening. She'd been asleep for approximately 3 hours, which she hadn't planned, and she came awake with the particular disorientation of someone whose body had made a unilateral decision. Garrick stopped when he saw her at the table. He had snow on his coat and the look of a man who'd covered ground fast. Pell will do it, he said. He'll want $2 more than you offered, but he'll go north and he'll carry the letter. He set his hat on the hook. He also told me something you need to know. She was fully awake now. What? Hans sat down across from her. They're not waiting 8 days. Hollister filed papers yesterday morning. He's calling it a welfare assessment. Claims there are concerns about the homestead's habitability and your safety. His jaw was tight. It's legal cover for sending men up here. Fern's hired 4 from outside Coldwater, not locals. People who won't have to live with the decision afterward. Marlowe was very still. How many total? 6. Hollister and Cresson will come as official witnesses. 4 hired hands. He looked at her steadily. They're planning to come tomorrow night. Pell heard it from a man at the tavern who was drunk enough to be specific. Tomorrow night. She looked at the map. She looked at the window, where the sky had gone, the deep blue-black of a clear winter evening, and the stars were already sharp. She ran the calculations, trail time, rock face conditions, the western ledge system she'd assessed today, the documents in their oilcloth packet, Pell and his timeline north. Are Pell's people in Kelbourne fast enough? She said. He says 3 days to reach the settlement and get people together. If they move quickly, they could be here by... We need to slow Hollister's group down without stopping them entirely. She was thinking aloud, working it as she talked. If we block the southern trail, they'll either turn back, which doesn't solve anything, they'll just come back with more, or they'll try the western route, which takes longer. She looked up. And which has a problem with the ledge? Garrick looked at her carefully. What did you do today? I assessed the western approach. I can see that from your coat. What did you do to it? I identified a trigger point on the ledge above the narrow section. I didn't do anything to it, yet. She met his gaze. If Cresson leads them through there, and if we trigger the ledge at the right moment, that could kill someone. It could, if I've misjudged the ledge dynamics, or if the timing is wrong. She kept her voice level because this was not a conversation that benefited from anything other than clarity. The amount of snow on that ledge at the speed of a controlled fall would block the path, not bury the path. The walls on both sides are too narrow for a significant debris spread. She paused. I think. You think. I'm not an engineer. I'm a woman who's read a great deal and has good spatial reasoning. She looked at him. You know that mountain. Does my assessment of the ledge sound right to you? I was quiet for a moment, processing the question honestly rather than reactively. The ledge hasn't come down in 8 years that I can remember. The base crack's been there 3 winters, he thought. Heavy load on the center section would drop it more or less straight. The walls would contain most of the spread. He paused. If people were 10 feet back from the narrow section when it went, they'd be stopped, not buried. Probably. He said it with the honesty of someone who didn't want to say probably, but couldn't say certainly. Probably is what we have, she said, given what we're working with. He stood up and went to the window. Outside, the mountain was quiet and enormous, and entirely indifferent to the problems of the people living on its face. There's something else, he said. Pell told me what Hollister's been telling people in town. What justification he's using for the welfare assessment. He turned. He's been saying I've been violent toward you, that you're here under duress. Marlowe felt something move through her that wasn't quite anger. It was colder than anger, more precise. Of course he is. People believe it because of... He stopped. Because of what they already believe about me. I know, she stood up, which is why when this is done, it needs to be done in front of witnesses, not just stopped. Exposed. She picked up the map. Hollister and Fern need to say out loud in front of people who aren't in their pocket what they've been doing. Because a man who is believed to be a monster can survive a confrontation. He can't survive a confrontation and a framing story, both, not without someone else telling the truth at the same volume. I was looking at her with that expression again, the one she'd stopped trying to name and started simply accepting as a kind of ongoing conversation that didn't need words. How do we get them to say it out loud? He said. We give them an audience they didn't plan for. She folded the map. Cresson is a surveyor. He knows what a fraudulent resurvey means professionally. Loss of license, possible criminal charge. If I can get him separated from the group and confront him directly with the discrepancy, he'll protect himself. He'll protect himself, she agreed. And his best protection at that point is cooperation. Garrick absorbed this. You're going to turn their own surveyor. I'm going to give him a compelling reason to remember which side of this he wants to be on. She set the map on the table. But none of it works if we can't get Pell's people from Kelbourne here in time. And none of it works if Hollister's men reach the homestead before we're ready. The fire shifted and popped. The room was warm and the world outside was not, and the distance between those two facts felt at this particular moment very thin. So we buy time, Garrick said. We buy time. I was quiet for a count of 3, 4, 5. Then he went to the shelf and took down the 2 lanterns, checked their fuel, set them on the table. Tell me exactly what you need me to do, he said, on the southern trail, step by step. She told him. He listened to all of it without interrupting, which had taken him 3 weeks to manage and which she noted without saying so. He asked 2 questions at the end, both good ones. She answered them. When she was done, he looked at the lanterns, the map, the oilcloth packet of documents that had started all of this. If this goes wrong, he started. If it goes wrong, we deal with what comes, she said. That's all. It wasn't reassurance. She didn't offer it as reassurance. He didn't take it that way. Get some sleep, he said. I'll take first watch. You were up before dawn and you've covered... I'll take first watch, he said again, in a tone that wasn't an argument so much as a decision that had already been made and didn't need revisiting. She looked at him. He looked back. 4 hours, she said, then wake me. She went to her room and lay down on the narrow bed in the dark, coat still on because the night was deep cold, and she listened to the sounds of the homestead. The fire in the next room, the wind picking up outside, Garrick's measured movements, the mountain itself, settling into its bones with the occasional creak and shift of stone contracting in the cold. Tomorrow night. She ran the plan again in her mind. Forward and then backward, looking for the gaps, the places where something could go wrong, the variables she couldn't control. There were more of those than she liked, but she'd built the best she could from what they had. That had always been the work, building something real from limited materials in an unfriendly environment. She'd been doing that her whole life. She closed her eyes. Sleep found her faster than she expected, which meant her body had made another unilateral decision, and this time she didn't argue with it. Outside, the mountain waited. Garrick woke her at 2 in the morning, which meant he'd let her sleep 5 hours instead of 4. She didn't call him on it. The extra hour had been a gift she hadn't known she needed, and arguing about gifts was a waste of time. Neither of them had. The sky outside the window was clear and brutal. The kind of winter night that looked beautiful from inside and tried to kill you outside. Stars too sharp and too many. Temperature dropped to the place where your breath didn't just show, but hung. Garrick had the fire built high and coffee on, and he'd laid out the equipment they'd need on the table with the same methodical care he gave to trap maintenance. 2 lanterns, 2 lengths of rope, the oilcloth document packet, a short-handled iron tool she'd asked him to modify 2 days ago. Its original purpose had been a fireplace poker, and its current purpose was something she hadn't needed to explain twice. Any movement on the trail? She asked. Nothing yet, but the snow's packed hard enough they won't make noise on the lower sections. He handed her the coffee. They could already be moving. She drank it standing up, thought through the sequence one more time, the way she'd been doing it in her sleep. South Trail, rock face, timing, the western ledge, crescent, the witnesses, the documents. A chain of events that depended on each link holding. And chains were only as reliable as their weakest point, and she knew exactly which point in this one worried her most. The timing on the slide, she said. If they reach the narrow section of the southern trail before we're in position, I'll be in position. He picked up his coat. I know that trail better than any of them. That's not what I'm worried about. He looked at her. I'm worried about you making a decision up there based on anger rather than timing. She kept her voice even, not accusatory, just true. If they come up here saying what Hollister's been saying about you, that you're violent, that I'm here against my will, it's designed to provoke a reaction. Fern needs you to react first. If you do, everything else we've built means nothing. He was quiet for long enough that she felt the weight of it. I know, he said finally. Garrick. I know, Marlowe. He said her name with a steadiness that told her it wasn't defensiveness. It was a man who had sat with his own worst impulses for long enough to recognize them by shape. I've done this before, lost my head when someone said the wrong thing, and handed them exactly what they wanted. His jaw moved. I'm aware of what it costs. She believed him, not because he was promising to be better than he was, but because he was naming the thing accurately, rather than denying it existed. That was a different quality of self-knowledge and harder to come by. Then we go, she said. They left the homestead together and separated at the first split in the trail, Garrick moving south toward the upper position above the rock face, Marlowe taking the path that curved east and then looped back toward the western approach. She carried the lantern low, shielded, moving as fast as the ice underfoot would allow. The mountain at night in December was a different country than the mountain in daylight. Sound traveled in ways that didn't make geographic sense. She could hear the creek in the eastern gully clearly from places where it should have been inaudible, but couldn't hear the wind that she knew was blowing on the upper ridge. The dark was absolute except where the stars and the snow reflected each other into a faint blue-grey light that was just enough to move by if you knew the ground. She knew it better than she'd known it a month ago. That itself was something. She heard them before she saw them. 6 men on the western route, moving in single file, lantern shuttered to narrow slits. Cresson was at the front. She could tell by the way he moved, reading the ground with the professional attention of someone who had surveyed this terrain and was using that knowledge. 2 of the hired hands directly behind him, then Hollister, who was not built for mountain climbing and was already audibly breathing harder than the terrain strictly required. 2 more hired hands at the rear. Marlowe was above them, on the ledge system she'd assessed 2 days ago, lying flat in the snow with the iron tool in her hand, and the cold seeping through her coat in a specific and patient way that would become a serious problem if she stayed in this position much longer than necessary. The plan was precise in its demands. She needed Cresson in the narrow section, the walls on both sides of him. She needed the rest of the group at least 10 feet back, which the trail's topography would enforce naturally, because the narrow section was only wide enough for single file and Cresson would instinctively slow as the walls compressed around him. She needed the rear of the group to have fully committed to the western route, past the point where turning back was easier than going forward. She waited. The cold was extraordinary. She'd stopped feeling her left hand around the same time she'd started counting Cresson's footsteps, and she'd been counting for 3 minutes. Her face was pressed against snow that had the texture of packed sand. She thought, briefly and practically, that if she misjudged the ledge dynamics, she was going to have a complicated morning explaining this to someone. And then she set that thought down and waited. Cresson entered the narrow section. She counted 4 steps. 5, 6. He was at the midpoint. She drove the iron tool into the fracture crack at the base of the ledge's center section with both hands and her full body weight. The sound it made was not dramatic. It was a low structural groan. The sound of something that had been arguing with itself for 3 winters, finally reaching a conclusion. Then the snow load on top of the ledge shifted, and the ledge shifted with it, and the whole section came down in a single controlled mass that was less like an avalanche and more like a heavy door falling shut. It hit the narrow section with a concussion she felt in her chest from 15 feet above. The yelling started immediately, not screaming, yelling, which told her nobody was buried, which was what she'd calculated and what she'd also been not quite certain about, and the relief of the confirmation was physical, a loosening in her chest that she allowed herself for approximately 2 seconds before she was moving. She came down off the ledge on the far side, away from the western route, hit the ground harder than she wanted to because the slope was steeper than she remembered in the dark, caught herself on a rock outcropping with her right hand and kept moving. Around the back of the formation, east, back to the southern trail approach. The southern trail was quiet, which meant Garrick had done his part, or the group hadn't reached that position yet, or something else had happened, and she didn't let herself follow that last possibility further because it wasn't useful. She went up. Cresson was sitting on a rock at the edge of the blocked western route when she found him. The hired hands had gone back down. She could see 2 lantern lights moving away in the valley dark below, and she understood immediately that paid men who'd been told a straightforward eviction job and found a mountain actively falling on them had reconsidered the terms of their employment. Hollister was still there, 10 feet from Cresson, looking between the blocked path and the dark with the expression of a man whose plan had stopped cooperating. Saw her lantern coming and opened his mouth. "Hollister," she said before he could speak. "Don't." He closed his mouth. Cresson looked up. He was a lean man in his 50s with a surveyor's permanent squint and the face of someone who had spent decades making precise measurements in unforgiving conditions. He was practical in the way that people who worked with physical facts rather than social ones tended to be practical. He looked at Marlowe and then at the block path and then at Marlowe again. "You did that," he said. "I assessed the ledge dynamics, yes." She sat down on the rock across from him. Her left hand was still mostly numb, and she was very cold, and she didn't have a great deal of time for preamble. "Holt Cresson, you signed a resurvey document 3 years ago that redrew the northern boundary of this property 400 feet south of the legal deed line." She reached into her coat and took out the oilcloth packet. "I have both documents." Cresson's jaw went tight. "I also know," she continued, "that a fraudulent survey filing means loss of license at minimum and criminal fraud charges at maximum, depending on how a territorial court interprets the intent." She held his gaze. "I'm not interested in your license or your legal future. I'm interested in the names above yours in this arrangement." "You can't," Hollister started. "Bray," Cresson said it flatly, without looking at the council chairman. Hollister stopped. Cresson looked at Marlowe. "What are you offering?" "Cooperation in exchange for a full account of who initiated the resurvey, who Vantage Land Partners actually represents, and what the intended outcome was for this property." She paused. "Given in writing, tonight, witnessed." "Witnessed by who?" Hollister said. "There's nobody." A lantern appeared at the top of the southern trail. Then another. Then 3 more. Then voices. Not many, maybe 8 or 9, but steady and moving with the particular deliberate pace of people who had come a long way and weren't stopping. Pal Maddock came through first. He looked at Marlowe with an expression that was equal parts impressed and deeply annoyed. The expression of a man who had ridden hard for days and wanted credit for it. Behind him came 7 people she didn't know, men and women from the Kelbourne settlements, traders and landowners, and 2 who carried themselves like settlement officials. People with direct economic interest in the Northern Passage and no relationship whatsoever with Cold Water Crossings Council apparatus. And behind them, coming down from the upper trail position, Garrick Vane. He looked at the assembled group on his stone shelf. He looked at Hollister, who had gone very still. He looked at Cresson, who was looking at the oilcloth packet in Marlowe's hand. He looked at Marlowe. She raised her eyebrows. "Well?" He almost smiled. Almost. "Mr. Cresson," he said. His voice was even. No fury in it. She noted that and knew what it cost him and respected it completely. "My wife has a document she'd like you to look at." Cresson talked for 2 hours. It came out in pieces, the way these things do. Not a clean confession, but a gradually loosening account. The kind that starts with "I only signed what they put in front of me" and ends somewhere considerably more specific and useful. Vantage Land Partners was 3 people: Fern, Hollister, and a timber merchant from a settlement 40 miles east named Drucker, whom nobody in the assembled group had heard of, but 2 of the Kelbourne traders recognized immediately and not warmly. The plan had been simple in structure and corrupt in execution. Establish a legal boundary discrepancy. Use the marriage arrangement as a mechanism to either remove Garrick through voluntary abandonment or create grounds for declaring the homestead ungovernable. Claim the Northern Passage under the resurveyed boundary. Charge transit fees to the Kelbourne settlements and refuse access to competing merchants. It had been running for 3 years. The stories about Garrick, amplified, embellished, spread with specific intent through Cold Water Crossing social networks, had been part of the operational infrastructure. A monster's land was easier to take than a man's. Marlowe had said, that on the mountain 2 weeks ago, and here was the proof of it, spoken aloud in the cold by a surveyor who had finally calculated that his best odds were no longer on Fern's side of the ledger. One of the Kelbourne officials, a compact woman named Sarah Bant, who had introduced herself with the quiet authority of someone accustomed to being the most prepared person in any room, wrote everything down. Every name, every date, every transaction. She had paper and a good pen and a territorial jurisdiction that superseded Coldwater Crossing's counsel on matters of property fraud. Hollister tried to speak once, around the 40-minute mark, and Garrick looked at him. Just looked. Hollister stopped speaking and did not start again. When Cresson was done, Bant read back her notes for confirmation. Cresson confirmed them. Bant dated and signed the document and passed it to the 2 Kelbourne traders for witness signatures. She looked at Marlowe. "Your copies of the deed and resurvey," she said. Marlowe handed over the oilcloth packet. Bant went through it with the efficiency of someone who had been looking at land documents professionally for years, and when she looked up, her expression was the specific, controlled neutrality of a person who has confirmed something they'd already suspected, and found the confirmation worse than expected. "The resurvey will be voided at the territorial office," she said. "The original deed boundary stands. I'll need both of you." She looked at Garrick, then Marlowe. "At Harrow Junction within 30 days to complete the record correction." "We'll be there," Marlowe said. Bant looked at Hollister. "You and Mr. Fern should expect correspondence from the territorial attorney's office. I'd suggest engaging legal counsel before it arrives." Hollister's face had gone the color of old ash. He looked at the group assembled on the stone shelf, the Kelbourne people, Pell Maddock, Garrick, Marlowe, the documents, the whole weight of it, and he seemed to understand that the particular calculation he'd been running for 3 years had finally come out at a number he hadn't planned for. He left without speaking. Cresson followed slower, without looking at anyone. The remaining hired hand, who'd stayed out of loyalty to a paycheck he was no longer certain he'd receive, went after them. The stone shelf was quiet for a moment. Then Pell Maddock said loudly and with the satisfaction of a man who has ridden 2 days in winter and wants recognition for it, "You're welcome, by the way, both of you." $2 above what was agreed, Marlowe said. 3. 2.5. Done. Pell looked at Garrick. "Your wife is terrifying, Vane." Garrick looked at Marlowe. "Yes," he said, "I'm aware." The Kelbourne people stayed the night. It was too late and too cold to descend, and the homestead that had been built for 1 and had uncomfortably accommodated 2 somehow held 9, because necessity is a better architect than comfort, and people who travelled hard were not particular about where they slept. Sarah Bant sat with Marlowe at the table, long after the others had found corners and blankets, going through the documents one more time with the methodical care of someone who wanted everything right before it reached the territorial office. Garrick was outside. She could hear him, moving around the perimeter of the property in the way he did when he was thinking, the long deliberate circuit that was his version of sitting still. "You taught yourself property law," Bant said. It wasn't quite a question. "From one book. That's—" Bant paused over the word. "That's considerable. I needed to know it." Marlowe looked at the documents. "Nobody was going to teach me anything useful. I had to find out what was mine to know." Bant looked at her steadily. She was a woman who had built a professional life in a context that didn't make that easy, and she recognized what she was looking at across the table. "When this is resolved at Harrow Junction," she said, "the Kelbourne Settlement Council is going to be establishing a formal trade agreement with the Northern Passage rights holder." She paused. "That position will require someone who understands property law and can negotiate contracts." Marlowe was quiet for a moment. "Garrick makes decisions about his land." "I'm aware. The position would involve both of you." Another pause. "If both of you were interested?" The fire had burned down to coals by then, throwing a low red light that made everything in the room look provisional and warm. Outside she could hear Garrick's footsteps on the frozen ground, still moving. "I'll discuss it with him," she said. Bant nodded and went back to the documents, and Marlowe went outside. The mountain at 4 in the morning, after everything, was perfectly still. Garrick was standing at the property's north edge, the place where the stone shelf dropped away, and you could see, on clear nights, the dark suggestion of the Kelbourne Valley in the far distance. He heard her coming and didn't turn, which by now she understood was not indifference but the opposite. A man comfortable enough with a presence that he didn't need to perform acknowledgement. She stood beside him. The cold was extraordinary, and she was tired in every layer of herself, and her left hand was only partially returned to function. And none of that felt like a problem right now, in the specific way that exhaustion after something real didn't feel like a problem. "It's done," he said. "The legal part isn't. Harrow Junction, I know, I meant tonight." He looked at the distance. "What they built against me, that's done." She understood the distinction. The paperwork was logistics. What had been dismantled tonight was 3 years of constructed story. The monster narrative, the institutional weight of it, the way a lie about a person's character becomes load-bearing when enough people repeat it long enough. That was harder to rebuild than a resurvey document, and harder to destroy than a property filing. But it had been destroyed, in front of witnesses, spoken aloud by the man who'd helped construct it. "They made you a monster," she said, "because it was easier than admitting they were the ones willing to do monstrous things." He turned and looked at her. "And you? What about me?" "They made you nothing, easy to use, easy to discard." His voice was level, but not detached. She'd learned to read the difference. "They counted on you to fail up here because they'd spent years telling you that you would." Marlowe looked at the dark valley below. "They weren't entirely wrong about the incentives," she said. "I did come up here for reasons that had nothing to do with courage." "You came up here and you stayed. That had something to do with it." He paused. "And whatever your reasons were at the start, they changed." She thought about arguing with that and then didn't, because he was right, and arguing with accurate things was a habit she was trying to break. "Bant offered us a position," she said. "Trade agreement coordination for the Northern Passage, both of us." He was quiet for a moment. "Both of us. I told her I'd discuss it with you." Another pause. The wind came off the upper ridge, mild by Black Ridge standards, just cold enough to remind you where you were. "We'd have to go to Harrow Junction anyway," he said. "Yes. And you know contract negotiation better than most people who get paid for it. And I know the passage." He looked at the distance again, the terrain, the conditions, the seasonal variation. "Between us," she said. He looked at her, the same 2 words she'd said on the trail down to Coldwater Crossing, weeks and a different world ago. He remembered. She could see that he remembered. "Between us," he said. It wasn't a declaration. It wasn't the kind of moment that got described in the stories people told afterward about how things began. It was 2 people standing on a cold mountain in the middle of the night, both of them damaged in specific ways, both of them clear-eyed about what they were and weren't, and both of them looking at the same direction. That was enough, more than enough. It was, in fact, the only foundation that actually held weight, not the romantic story, not the rescue narrative, not the idea that love was something that arrived and solved things. Just 2 people who had seen each other plainly and decided, without ceremony, to keep standing in the same place. Spring came to Black Ridge the way spring always came at elevation. Reluctantly, in pieces, taking back every concession overnight, and then making it again in the morning. The kitchen garden went in during the 3rd week of April, on a morning when the soil had finally thawed deep enough to accept the seeds Marlowe had carried up the mountain in November. Garrick broke the ground with a mattock, and she worked behind him planting, and they didn't talk much because the work didn't require it. The Harrow Junction trip had happened in February, on roads that were brutal, and in weather that was worse. The Territorial Records Office had voided the Vantage Land Partners resurvey in a proceeding that lasted 3 hours and that Hollister did not attend, which his legal counsel later confirmed was because he was otherwise engaged, preparing a response to the fraud investigation that Sarah Bant had set in motion before she'd left Black Ridge. Fern's store had closed by March. Drucker, The Eastern timber merchant had settled quietly with the territorial attorney's office in terms that nobody made public, but that appeared, from the observable evidence, to have been expensive. The trade agreement with the Kelbourne settlements was signed in the same Harrow Junction proceeding. It ran to 14 pages, which was Marlowe's doing. She'd spent 3 weeks drafting it with Bant's input and Garrick's knowledge of the passage conditions, and the result was a document specific enough that it was difficult to misinterpret and comprehensive enough that it addressed the access questions that had been at the root of the entire scheme. The Kelbourne Council's lead negotiator had read it twice and then looked at Marlowe over the table and said simply, "You wrote this yourself?" "With input," she said. He'd looked at Garrick, who was sitting beside her with his hands on the table and his expression neutral, in the way it got when he was privately satisfied about something. "Good input," the negotiator said. Garrick had said yes. In Coldwater Crossing, the stories changed. Not immediately, not cleanly. Stories about people don't change cleanly. They erode. The way stone erodes, losing their edges slowly and becoming something different without anyone being able to identify the exact moment of transformation. The monster story about Garrick Vane lost its authority gradually as the trade agreements took effect and the Northern Passage opened properly, and the money that came through it became real and present in ways that made the prior arrangement look clearly like what it had been. People revised their memories without admitting they were revising. That was ordinary human behavior. Marlowe had no patience for it and no particular anger about it either. People protected themselves through belief. When the belief stopped serving the protection, they found different beliefs. That was the mechanism. What she minded less than she expected was that some of them came up the mountain. Traders first, with practical questions about transit timing and winter conditions. Then a few who came with something closer to curiosity. They'd heard things about the Black Ridge homestead that didn't match the prior stories and wanted to see the discrepancy for themselves. Marlowe dealt with them at the door, direct and not unwelcoming, setting the terms of interaction before they could establish their own. Garrick stayed inside during most of these exchanges, not out of hostility, but because he was fixing the woodshed, which had needed attention since November, and which he was approaching with the thoroughness of someone who intended the repair to outlast him. Dana Ellsworth came in May, the woman who'd spoken within earshot of Marlowe at the market stalls about being sent up to him. She came with a plausible commercial reason. Her family had freight that needed moving north, and she stood at the homestead door and looked at Marlowe with the specific, complicated expression of a person encountering their own past cruelty in someone they discounted. Marlowe gave her the freight rates and the transit timing. She was polite and specific and entirely professional. She did not mention the market stalls. When Dana left, Garrick came out of the woodshed with sawdust on his coat and looked at Marlowe's face. "Someone from town," he said. "A customer," she said. He nodded and went back inside. She stayed on the step for a moment, looking at the trail down. Then she went in after him. There was an evening in late May, when the days had finally gotten long enough to mean something, that she came out of the homestead and found him sitting on the front step with the small carving in his hands, the one she'd seen him working the night of the first storm, 4 months ago. She could see it clearly now in the light, and it was a bear, one-eared, recognizably particular. She sat down next to him. Their shoulders were an inch apart. "Argument," she said. "Saw him yesterday. East tree line." He turned the carving over. "He's lost weight over winter. Bears do." "I know, still." He set the carving on his knee. "Seems like a hard thing, going to sleep fat and waking up with nothing left and having to start over." She looked at the eastern tree line. The birches were leafing out, that specific pale green of very new growth that only lasted a few weeks before it deepened, and you forgot what it had looked like. "But they do," she said, "start over. Every year, every year." I was quiet for a while. The evening light came at an angle that caught the stone of the ridge above them and made it look, briefly, like something warmer than rock. Somewhere in the eastern gully the creek was running high with snowmelt, audible even from here. "I'm glad you didn't leave," he said, "at the woodpile." It was a plain sentence. He didn't dress it up or expand on it because he was a man who'd learned at some cost that plain sentences were more reliable than elaborated ones. "I'm glad I didn't either," she said. That was the whole of it, no more needed. They sat on the step while the light changed and the mountain did what mountains do: endured, held its ground, carried the weight of everything placed on it, and changed not quickly but truly over time, in ways that mattered. Below them, cold water crossing made its smoke and its noise and its small daily reckonings. Above them, Black Ridge went on being itself, indifferent, enormous, demanding. Between them, something that had started as necessity and stubbornness and clear-eyed calculation had become something neither of them had a clean name for. Not a story with the right shape, not the thing that got told in parlors or at market stalls. Something messier and more specific and considerably more real. Two people, one mountain, the hard work of building something from what you actually had rather than what you'd been told you deserved. It wasn't a fairy tale. It was better than that. It lasted.